Well,
Thanks very much for coming on.
sure.
I'm just waiting 1 second for Tyler, the producer, to give us the go-ahead.
Okay.
I was sorry to hear about Jim Dyer, huh?
Yeah, he'd been sick for a while. He lived up on Temple Street here, so
Yeah,
yeah.
you must have known him.
Yeah, he was a good guy.
A big Caleb Cushing fan.
Yes, yeah, I can remember. Yeah, I listened to him a couple of times. Yeah.
Well, one of the first stories I did for the Daily News in about 2012 was he and a team had just refurbished the Caleb Cushing Memorial
Oh, yes.
Cemetery, and they did a good job and brought a lot of attention to Caleb Cushing, who was really an amazing person.
Oh, yeah, he was. Absolutely. He was man of the time.
And he was, could have been a presidential candidate, but everyone got cranky at him because he didn't seem to be an abolitionist enough. But
Right.
he later said, and other people said, he didn't want a civil war. And, as I look back on things, that was a scary notion. My God, we're going to have a civil war?
Right. Yeah, he could have. And he was concerned about the whole union. It was going to collapse. So
Yeah. And so I can definitely see that as a problem.
sure. Did you see Biden introduce his cabinet?
No.
He just introduced. Yeah.
I think it's going to be good,
Yeah, and just the whole presentation of it. You can look it up on internet.
Mhm.
Just a nice presentation. Everyone spoke just like 2 or 3, 4 minutes. It was great.
Did
Very
John
nice.
Kerry come on?
Yeah, he was there. Yeah, and it was all about the U.S. It was
Okay.
all about public servant, as opposed to the 2 pronouns I and me.
I don't know if we're on Glee, but because I think they forgot about the program today.
Oh, here we go.
Are we on? Tyler, are we on?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to Life Along the Merrimack, which is a weekly podcast where we discuss the life and health and history of the Merrimack River. And we're lucky today to have a guest, Ghlee Woodworth, who is a local historian. She's written a couple books on the town, and she's a remarkable resource here. And this is, of course, 96.3 radio, Joppa Radio, and also the local cable Channel 9 Comcast. So Ghlee, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for appearing.
Well, thank you, Dyke, for asking me, and finally we were able to work out finally a time.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you is you've written 2 wonderful books that I'm aware of, and
Thank you.
One of the major historians in town. How did you get interested in the history of Newburyport?
Well, it was all unintentional. I went off because growing up here, high school, then college, grad school. I worked at a small private school, college.
Mhm.
Then I went off to Peace Corps, and I spent about 14 years with the United States Peace Corps. And then I was back here full time in 2005. My now late father, Todd Woodworth, began Tiptoe Through the Tombstones
Mhm.
at Oak Hill Cemetery back in '88. And he continued giving those tours throughout the years. And I heard about those tours. And he gave his last tour in 2005.
Mhm.
And he told me, and he said, I think this is my last tour. And I said, well, okay, I'll do them. And I knew absolutely nothing about Newburyport history, except that I was 12th generation.
Mhm.
Robert Adams, my ancestor, settled in the 1630s. So I knew I was old and Newburyport was old.
Mhm.
So I just started researching, and I was able to do my first cemetery tour at Oak Hill for Yankee Homecoming in 2006. And I enjoyed the research.
Who are some of the people who would take your tour? Would they be people looking for ancestors, or would they be people visiting a town, or maybe just local town folk who wanted to learn more.
Right. It was a lot of people in that Yankee homecoming 2006. My father was still living. And so there was a newspaper article saying Glee's taken over tours for her dad. And there were over 40 people who showed up. And it was
Really?
just a part of, I think, supporting my father. Many or most of them had been on my father's tours. And now here's the daughter. So we want to find out what is she talking about? And so throughout the years, since 2006, I have had people say, oh, I went on your father's tour.
Oh, really?
And now I've been on your tour. Yeah.
Each cemetery, has a different history, but when did cemeteries get started here in town?
Well, they certainly back in the 1600s, there were cemeteries. There's the first settlers cemetery down on Route 1A past Tendercrop on the right.
Oh,
There's
yes.
a small little sign. And so there's stones there, certainly not the original stones, but that was one of the first settlers. And then you've got some of those early cemeteries in the Byfield area too. Then there was First Parish on High Road across from the First Parish Church.
Yeah.
Here in Newburyport, one of the first cemeteries was certainly families in their backyard. They buried people there. But Sawyer Hill, which is kind of a hidden private cemetery up across Maudsley State Park. And that has some of the earliest settlers in the West End, early 1700s. Then St. Paul's, originally the St. Paul's Church up at the Belleville Cemetery.
Yes,
there's a very old section. Then certainly St. Paul's, when they built their church in the mid 1800s, they had the traditional gray cemetery around the church. Then behind the Mall, there were the two city cemeteries.
Oh, yes.
Old Hill Burying Ground, 1729. And then across the street is Highland, which is 1800. That's an extension of Old Hill. And then Oak Hill comes in at 1842. And that was a group of citizens who they knew they needed another cemetery. And they modeled this cemetery after Mount Auburn, which was started in the 1830s. And Oak Hill is it's a rural garden landscape cemetery. So unlike the cemetery behind the Mall, which is a hill, there are no paths. It's just everybody's buried here, there, and everywhere. Oak Hill has roads and paths through and lots of landscaping. And so
are they differentiated by the Catholic cemetery, the Protestant cemetery? Did that dichotomy exist?
Yes. St. Mary's, the church started in the 1850s, maybe late 1840s, down on Charles Street. And this was in response to the hundreds of Irish folks immigrants coming in, many of them on the train, which the train started in the 1840. And so immigrants were coming in to work in the mills and the shoe factories and so forth. So you had the Catholic Church, and then finally they bought the land on Green Street in the 1860s or so and built that church on Green Street. And finally, in about 1870, they consecrated land up on Story Ave, and St. Mary's was created. Now, many of the Irishmen and women who had passed away, buried in, for example, the city cemeteries, they were transferred after the St. Mary's was concentrated. Many of the families exhumed their family members and buried them up at St. Mary's.
And you've written about this, and one of my first stories, I was with the Daily News for about 5 or 6 years, from 2012 to say 2017. And one of the first stories I did was this group was honoring Caleb Cushing.
Yes.
In the mid-19th century, he was a tremendous force, a congressman, the first mayor of Newburyport, actually, a presidential hopeful at that time. And Caleb Cushing had a beautiful memorial to him. And I was sorry to hear that Jim Dyer, who was involved in that, passed away recently. But for many of those prominent Newburyport residents, are they buried right here in town and people could see them if they walk through the graveyard?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And there's the city cemeteries. There, people are buried generally anywhere and throughout the city, but you certainly have the Catholics at St. Mary's. Generally speaking, Belleville, a private cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
Those folks in the Belleville, the beautiful town, the what we call the North End, buried in Belleville. And then certainly the congregation members of St. Paul's, they're probably, many of them are buried right there at the St. Paul's graveyard. Oak Hill, some say yes, it was a little bit, some of the who's who in town are buried in Oak Hill. So you can find members, and then there's always those family members who went off for whatever reasons and left Newburyport. But many of those were brought back to be buried with their family members in Newburyport cemeteries.
When your two books had a lot of history of Newburyport in them, and getting away from the cemeteries for a moment, it seems like one of the signature events of the 19th century in craft in Newburyport, as we have, was the Great Fire of 1811. That have a major effect. I seem to remember that it was I don't remember, but it was mostly wood when it burnt. But then the state said, if we're going to give you money, we're going to make it brick. Was that a part of history?
Yes, absolutely. And I think every town and city, everywhere had their great fire, and some towns and cities had more than one great fire. But certainly 1811 started on the In Street area, and picture a stable there, and caught fire. And you got to remember, those days there weren't fire trucks to come whistling down the street with a water hose. They were bucket brigades. And that fire spread very quickly throughout the wooden buildings. Fortunately, no one was hurt or died, but over 200 buildings were destroyed.
Phenomenal.
And along the In Street area now, State Street, all the wharf areas. And within a week, the selectmen of the town said, okay, if we're going to rebuild, anything over 10 foot has to be made of brick. And so that's where we are looking at today, some of those brick buildings that were built by 1820.
And when we look back in that era, it strikes me that kind of a golden era for Newburyport was maybe between 1790 and 1811, because the war, the revolution was over. There weren't too many wars out there. We had many ships and great trade. So would it was 1790 to about 1811. It sounds like that was a pretty prosperous period for the town.
Yes, absolutely. And wouldn't it be nice just to step back in time and to see and walk through those shipyards? Certainly there were the small schooners and fishing vessels that were built, but then there were the ships that were over 100 feet long, and the size of City Hall. And to see something like that from the very beginning, to the men going out in the forest to cut those pieces of wood. They had a whole list, and then thrown in the river to come down to the shipyards or on oxen and wagon, and then to see them put those ships together. And then these ships were, and the shipbuilders of Newburyport were well respected around the world, including Europe. We had many European owners. Because back then there was not just one owner. There would be maybe 4 or 5 or 6 owners. They would invest in a quarter of the ship. Anyways, they would sail, and our Newburyport ships sailed over to 70 ports around the world. So we were very well known and very well respected, and the import and all the cargo that was coming into port it was just an incredible time for
Mhm.
Newburyport.
And talking about boats down on the waterfront, Newburyport, as you know, is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. They built the first Coast Guard vessel in 1790. But there were a lot of fishing vessels here,
Mm.
weren't there, Ghlee? I mean,
Yes, yeah, and that kind of gets overlooked. But we certainly we had over 180 fishing vessels here in Newburyport in the 1800s, and that certainly dwindled down as the 1900s went along. But we did have a huge fishing trade, and we were up in Canada and Labrador
mhm.
and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and so forth. I don't know if we ever rivaled the Gloucester,
Yeah.
Essex fishermen, but we certainly had a huge industry of fishermen.
And there is a very handsome memorial to modern fishermen, which is on the waterfront, right?
Yes,
The boardwalk.
absolutely. Yeah.
When they rebuilt the Harbor Masters headquarters, I thought they did a really nice job of a memorial for those fishermen since 2000,
Yes,
their lives. You know, I thought that was a wonderful job they did.
yes, they did. Very nice, and it's well kept, and beautiful gardens and sitting benches around it. Very nice memorial.
One thing that your two books have brought out, that Newburyport was kind of fortunate in when we rebuilt in recent years, starting in 1970, rather than, excuse me, tear down some of the older buildings, they decided to restore them.
Yes.
You know, and I think Newburyport is actually known nationally for being one of the first communities that took the redevelopment money and rather than tear down the middle of town for Zayres or Kmart, they
Right.
preserved it. Can you talk about a couple of the players at that time? I think Byron Matthews was one, possibly George Lawler as well. Very valuable to the modern history.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories, and I didn't know anything about it. I was growing up here, but I didn't know what was happening. Then I was in high school and went off to college. So when I started doing research and tours after 2006, and then I got into slideshows and so forth, I kept hearing about urban renewal, and I thought, wait a minute, I've got to read and research about this, and what is this story? And what I learned subsequently over the years is that it came down to an 18-year-old young woman, a senior in high school, who walked into her dad's study and said, "Daddy, you have to save the downtown."
Mm-hmm.
And this was Mary Wilkins Hasslinger.
Mm-hmm.
And she still lives in that home. Her home that she grew up in. Her dad was Dr. Robert Wilkins. So long story short, he said, okay, and just got a group of folks together and went to see George Lawler and talked, and he had lots of friends down in DC and so forth. And I tell this story through quotes of these folks in my second book, right here, Newburyport Clipper Heritage Trail, Volume 1. And George Lawler, Mayor George Lawler, who doesn't get the credit as he deserves. And I told his daughter, Marianne, I said, I've learned about the story, and your dad will always get the credit, because he had papers on his desk that the city council passed in 65 that gave permission to bulldoze the downtown. And George Lawler met with these folks more than once and talked and said, okay, and listened and said, okay, let's give him a chance. And so those papers were on his desk, and all he had to do was sign those papers, and the downtown would have been gone.
Yeah.
But he did not sign those papers. So after he completes his term as mayor, now here comes Byron Matthews. And he was a wonderful advocate. He, along with Jack Bradshaw, a couple others, would go down in Washington, D.C. And those were the days when you could walk through the Capitol halls and knock on the senator's door.
Yes.
Right? And so he did quite a bit of that. And they were able to at least get about $70 million in for the restoration of these buildings. Also, who's important is Hack Cranberg. He
Yes.
was the president of the Institution for Savings. And at that time, banks were not allowed to loan money to folks who were renovating buildings.
Hmm.
So he and who, a rep or senator, it just slipped my mind, was able to get legislation through that they were able to loan money to these folks who bought the buildings to restore them.
Well, this is 96.3 radio and Comcast cable. I'm with Ghlee Woodworth, a local historian. One piece that I haven't fully got straight in my mind is there used to be a lot of coal on the waterfront. You know, ships would come in with coal and
Yes.
it's sucked out. It seems like that's another asset that is worth appreciating, the fact that the coal, which is very dirty, of course, the coal repositories basically left, and then the greater work started on the waterfront. Is
Right.
that
Right. Absolutely. That was another chapter. So you had the shipbuilding chapter, and that kind of went downhill by the mid 1800s. Then, starting in the 1840s and 50s, you had the cotton mills, and then here come the shoe factories.
Yes.
In the late 1800s, the Dodge Shoe Factory, and this is still amazing to me, was a top producer in shoes in the United States. And the comb factories,
Yes.
yes, the comb factories, this was the hub. This was the headquarters, so to speak, of the comb factories. And the families invented the machines and so forth. And so people around the country who were creating these, making these decorative combs, they would come to Newburyport and communicate with
Mhm.
folks in Newburyport for the latest inventions and techniques and so forth. Okay, now here comes the coal industry in the 1870s.
Yes.
And what helped facilitate is the city railroad came in off a spur along Marches Hill down through Joppa, the South End neighborhood,
Yes.
along the waterfront, where now is our rail trail. And the coal was coming up from Pennsylvania and was being distributed through all parts of New England. And so that was the industrialization, so to speak, of the waterfront.
So the river got dirty for many reasons in the old days, but you must have been a kid and it was probably in the process of being cleaned up. I think of the Clean Water Act of 1972. Ed
Yeah.
Muskie was a key figure in that. I see that as a major useful event for the river and for Newburyport. The river's gotten cleaner, Ghlee. Has that been helpful?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And still, as the mayor and the different officials are dealing with, it's great that we got our part cleaned up, but then you've got communities further up the Merrimack River who not so much have, for whatever many reasons, have not cleaned up their area, and a lot of that's due to sewage treatment plants and so forth. And so we end up, of course, getting all that pollution, but definitely has cleaned up. And I remember being on the river as a kid in a boat, and we go fishing and so forth. And it certainly, of course, helped the wildlife.
Yes.
Fish.
I mean, for one thing, a lot of people in the bird watching field, can talk about how things have improved. Of course, Plum Island is also a wonderful asset. But as the river got cleaner, certainly some fish came back.
Yes.
The birds. It's just a good moment in terms of where Newburyport is now. I might mention to listeners that just last week there was a bill in front of the State House in Beacon Hill to make it mandatory for the sewage treatment plants upriver to warn folks downriver if there's been a discharge of effluent. That means as the rainwater gets in the sewage treatment plant, it can't hold all the effluent and the rainwater, so they let go of everything. Now, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, knows about this. They're putting pressure on them to improve the situation. But as Ghlee said, it's complex. But we've got to think, Ghlee, that the river is cleaner and will continue. The fight will continue to keep it clean, I'm thinking.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And because the holdup is nowadays, how many hundreds of millions of dollars does it take to do a build
Oh, yes.
new sewage treatment plants? And that's certainly some of the holdup is needing federal monies.
Yes.
Your little old taxpayer is not going to be able to help out in this situation.
Well, if we do have a change in administrations, and we'd like to think we will,
Yeah.
perhaps the new administration will be more benevolent when it comes to things.
Hopefully.
Well, Ghlee, our time is about up. I want to thank you for being here. What is your next project? I know that your recent book on the downtown and the tours is terrific. Are you going to continue with that, or what are your thoughts?
Yes. Yep, I'm continuing. I'm selling that book up at Oak Hill Cemetery Brown Chapel on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and I'm currently now working on volume 2.
Oh, great.
So volume 2 will, as the first book was focused more on the downtown, this volume 2 of the trail will focus on from Maudsley State Park all the way through Newburyport down to Plum Island. It will have about 90 locations to read about, maps and legends, of course. And so that's what I'm working on now.
Well, don't forget Low Street. I live, Vicki Hendrickson and I, my wife, we live on Low Street. That may be part 3 of your research. It'll be a slim volume, as I used to say. But anyway, we live on Low Street. We love Newburyport. I have been with Ghlee Woodworth. Ghlee, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Dyke.
Books, good luck with your continued research. And for listeners and viewers, thanks for watching. We'll be back next Tuesday to talk about the Merrimack River and the environs. And until then, I'm Dyke Hendrickson, host of this podcast. Have a good Thanksgiving. Goodbye, Ghlee.
Bye, Dyke. Thank you.
Thank you.